we are going to continue our discussions on the different tools that are there available for a penetration tester to do any kind of a server side attack. So, in the previous session we had looked at a couple of tools for getting more details on a particular web server or a web portal by doing a crawling of that particular site. So, in this session we are going to look at a proxy software tool and what kind of detail we could possibly get from using this particular tool. Now, before we get into that we just need to do a quick recap on what we exactly mean by a proxy software and why does somebody use a proxy software. So, a proxy software is typically used for some of the application protocols which will actually act as an intermediary between the client and the actual destined server. Now, why should a proxy software be lying as an intermediary between the client and the server? There are a few reasons for it. One of the reasons that is very commonly used, especially if you consider for example the HTTP protocol, is that if I use a HTTP proxy software application, using this proxy I will be able to cache the contents from the server locally on this particular server where I am running the proxy software and thereby get the response back for the clients who is actually asking for the contents very quickly as compared to trying to fetch the contents from a remote server every time. So, for example, if I have for example a proxy software application running on one of my servers in my local network, only the first instance where I do not have the content that has been requested right now over HTTP available locally as part of my cache, I need to really go all the way to the internet, fetch the content and then deliver it to the client. But having done that once, if I am basically able to service the next request that is coming for the same content from my local network from other clients, I will be able to have a quicker turnaround time for those requests, because my traffic need not be traveling all the way over the internet to reach the actual destined server and then come back. So, this is predominantly one reason why the administrators prefer to use a proxy software, and another predominant reason is also to do some sort of an administration of either enabling or disabling access for different type of users. So, the different type of users here could actually mean based on the user ID, or it could be based on IP addresses from which the access is being made and so on. So, for example, if you might have actually come across some organizations who do not allow access to some of the social engineering sites like Facebook or Twitter from their organization network, right. But this is not a common policy across all the employees in that organization, but there will be certain employees at a certain level who will be allowed access, right. So, again with something with a tool like a proxy software, the administrator will be able to sort of differentiate between who is actually trying to access a particular URL site, and by the policy defined as part of the software right now either allow or deny that particular request. So, predominantly you will find that the proxy software is actually used for these kind of purposes. So, one is to basically improve the performance of the request turnaround times, and two, to sort of have it as an effective administration tool whereby access policies can be very easily implemented. Now, there is a tool called ZA Proxy that is actually available and very commonly used. It is basically an Intercept Proxy which is really designed for security testing of web applications. So, with this tool being available in Kali Linux, so it is actually available under web applications submenu and web application fuzzers grouping. You can really find out how the proxy server is actually working and what are the initial steps that are really required to actually have it started. So, when you actually open up this particular application, you might actually have a pop up asking if you would like to actually have a SSL root certificate that is created specifically for you. So, as you would have seen and learnt in the previous IS3 cores as well as during the refresher part of this particular IS4, SSL is basically an encryption mechanism that is used between the browser and the server, the web server, typically to have your contents all encrypted before it is actually sent out onto the internet, right. So, this certificate will basically allow, this creation of the certificate will basically allow the HTTPS traffic over SSL also to be sort of intercepted and then presented to you as the user of this particular tool. So, what exactly happens is, first one needs to generate this particular certificate. So, at the pop up that is there, you will have a generate button that will be available. So, when one presses the generate button, the certificate will be generated that you see here, and then the certificate will actually be required to be saved by pressing the save button with the particular name available. So, one possible example of a name could be something like this. So, whatever name that is actually being given as part of the save dialog box, the file, the certificate that is actually getting generated here will be saved in that particular name, right. Once this particular file is actually generated and then saved, this needs to be imported as a valid certificate, right. Now, why is this needs to be imported as a valid certificate is that because the certificate is actually used for the exchange of what key has to be used by the client browser and the actual web server on the server side to be used for encryption and decryption. So, depending on what browser you have, the menu options could be slightly different. So, assuming that we are actually making use of the Firefox browser, we really go into edit preferences, and then on the advanced tab you will have an encryption sub tab in which we could see a view certificate, right. So, there you could actually have a import button and then choose that particular certificate that you have generated and then saved in the previous dialog and give that as the file to be imported, right. So, whatever is the .cer file that was actually saved as part of the generation of the certificate and the saving process, that CER file is right now given here as part of importing, after which this certificate file will be also used by the browser for exchanging of the key required for doing the encryption or the decryption between the browser and the server side, right. So, as we had seen before, this key needs to be exchanged between the two sides or the SSL mechanism to be successful, and using this particular certificate, the key could potentially be getting exchanged between the two ends on the client and the on the server side, right. Now, before we actually go ahead and use the ZA proxy tool, we also need to do one more setting on the browser side where we actually need to configure the proxy configuration, right. So, the proxy configuration, we specify where is the proxy going to be available. So, in this particular case it is localhost, which is essentially nothing but the same server, the same machine on which we are right now running the browser also, and then what is the port number on which it is actually going to be running, right. So, this is basically the well known port number that is typically used for a proxy server. So, some of the other port numbers that are used for a proxy server could be either 8000 or 80,000 and so on, but in this case we will actually have this running on port number 8080. So, we specify the proxy localhost because the proxy is going to be running on the same machine as the browser that is currently running on, and we specify 8080 as a port number on which the proxy is going to be actually listening and running. So, after this is actually set, we just press the OK button here, which would have completed the configuration of all the required things to be done as far as the browser is concerned. So, after this is actually set, in the Zap proxy, the tool that I would open up from the Kali Linux menu option that we saw, I basically give the URL that I need to basically have make an attempt to sort of do the penetration testing right now, right. So, we go ahead, press the URL that is there, and then after some point in time we find out the different URLs that is actually getting accessed at the below frame there, right. So, in each of these frames you could potentially have an attack that the penetration tester could be making use of, and all those possible vulnerabilities are available as part of the alerts tab in this particular tool. So, if you look at it here, for the specific attempt that was made on that particular URL that was given as an input, there has been 4 different alerts that has actually been generated, right. So, one alert is a cross domain JavaScript source file inclusion, another could be a private IP disclosure, and so on and so forth. So, each of these alerts again has the possibility of it either being a very serious alert that needs the attention of the administrator to be immediately addressing it, or alternatively it could also be something which is just information purposes, which would not possibly be a very serious issue to be looked at or addressed immediately. So, depending on whether it is a security administrator who is actually running this tool to find out the different vulnerabilities, or the penetration tester who is actually trying to get more and more details of this particular site that he is trying to target for attacking appropriately, each of the alerts that is actually getting listed here will be handled differently. If it is an administrator, the administrator will try to actually resolve those alerts as quickly as possible, and similarly if it is basically the penetration tester who has run this tool and got this detail, before the administrator basically sorts of gets alerted with these alerts, the penetration tester would try to make use of these loopholes and then penetrate that system successfully. Thank you.